There was a boy who lived in a house of glass, believing the Syndicate was a world of silk ties and silent handshakes. He was the spare, a gentle soul kept in the light because his brother, Jin-ho, was willing to live in the dark. But light is a fragile thing. The night of the winter coup, the glass shattered. The Incheon docks were a graveyard of shipping containers and freezing rain. Jin-ho, the crowned heir, was no longer a god. He was a man leaking life through a tattered silk tie wrapped around a gut wound. He shoved Sun-woo toward a heavy steel crate, his breathing a wet, ragged whistle. "Don't look back, Sun-woo," Jin-ho wheezed, pressing a heavy, cold cipher ring into his brother's palm. "Forget the library. Forget my name. Just live." The heavy door slammed shut, plunging Sun-woo into darkness. Outside, the world erupted. Muzzle flashes flickered through the gaps in the steel like dying stars. Sun-woo pressed his face to the metal, screaming for a brother who could no longer hear him. He watched through a sliver of space as Jin-ho stood upright, a silhouette against the rain, drawing the tactical squad's fire away from the crate. The sniper's first round caught Jin-ho in the shoulder, the second in the chest. Jin-ho didn't fall. He stepped forward, firing back until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. Then came the stray round. It punched through the steel of the crate with a high, mechanical shriek. The lead glanced off Sun-woo's temple, a white-hot needle that redrew the map of his brain in a single microsecond. He didn't feel the pain, only the sudden, violent silence as his consciousness fractured. As the crane lifted the crate toward the black water of the harbor, Sun-woo's world narrowed to a single image, his brother's body hitting the concrete, washed clean by the rain. The boy died that night. The spare was buried in the river. 6 months of silence followed, a coma so deep it felt like the bottom of the ocean. But beneath the trauma, the cipher ring was still pressed into a hand that was learning how to become a fist. The debt was recorded, the clock was set, and in the basement of a woman they called the Reaper, the boy was about to wake up. Sun-woo woke to the sound of a steady, rhythmic hiss. It wasn't the ocean, and it wasn't the rain. It was the mechanical sigh of an industrial steamer. He tried to move his hand, but his fingers felt like lead weights tethered to a body that didn't belong to him. His vision was a blurred smear of concrete gray and fluorescent yellow. When he tried to focus, a sharp, white-hot spike of pain driven by the scar on his temple forced his eyes shut. The boy who had lived in a house of glass was gone, and for a long time, there was only the dark. "Don't fight the light, kid. Your brain is still trying to remember how to map the room." The voice was deep, textured like gravel, and carried an accent that didn't belong in the high-rise boardrooms of the Koryo repository. Sun-woo forced his eyelids open again. The world slowly coalesced into a basement. Rows of heavy laundry machines lined the far wall, their vibrations humming through the floor. Above him, a single bulb flickered. Sitting in a steel chair a few feet away was a woman who looked like she was carved from basalt. Her skin was a deep, weathered mahogany, her hair a crown of silver coils. She wore sharp, gold-rimmed spectacles and was cleaning a disassembled firearm with a precision that made Sun-woo's chest tighten. "Where?" Sun-woo's voice was a dry croak. His throat felt like he had swallowed glass. "A basement in the industrial district," the woman said, not looking up from the slide of the pistol. 6 months. That's how long you've been under. Most people who take a round to the parietal lobe don't wake up, but your brother paid for the best doctors money could hide. The mention of Jin-ho hit Sun-woo harder than the trauma. The image of his brother standing in the rain, a silhouette of defiance as the bullets tore through him, flared in his mind. Sunwoo's left hand began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that rattled the metal frame of the cot he lay on. "Stop it," the woman commanded. Her voice wasn't unkind, but it was absolute. "The tremor is just feedback. Your hardware is damaged, but the software is still there. Focus on the hiss of the steam. Count the cycles." Sunwoo took a ragged breath. 1, 2, 3. The tremor subsided into a dull hum. "Who are you?" "My name is Muna. To your brother, I was an insurance policy. To the rest of the world, I'm the Reaper who retired before they could put a price on my head." She finally looked at him, her eyes cold and analytical. "Jin-ho knew the Koryo repository was rotting. He knew your uncle Tae-jun was moving the pieces for a liquidation. He paid me a decade's worth of blood money to ensure that if the house fell, you wouldn't be buried in the rubble." "He's dead," Sunwoo whispered. It wasn't a question. "He died a king's death," Muna said, sliding the magazine into the grip of the gun with a metallic clack. "But the throne is occupied by a coward in a white suit. Tae-jun has spent the last half-year erasing your father's name. The repository is no longer a family legacy. It's a meat grinder. And you are the last loose end." Sunwoo looked down at his hands. They were thin, the skin translucent. He felt like a ghost inhabiting a corpse. The soft air had spent his life reading about heroes in leather-bound books, but the weight of the cipher ring still pressed against his palm, reminding him that the story had changed. Muna stood up. She walked over to the cot and dropped a heavy olive-drab duffel bag at his feet. Inside, Sunwoo saw the matte black finish of a suppressed 9mm, several magazines, and a stack of forged passports. "Here is the reality, Sunwoo," Muna said, leaning over him. "I have enough money from your brother to get you to Zurich. You can disappear. You can buy a library and spend the rest of your life pretending the Koryo repository doesn't exist. That is the exit. It's what Jin-ho wanted for you." She paused, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a single, spent brass casing, one she had recovered from the docks. She placed it on the bedside table. "Then there is the other option. Your uncle is at the top of the obsidian tower. He thinks he's safe because he thinks you're a memory. I can't give you back the life you had. I can't fix your brain. But I can teach you how to use what's left of you to settle the debt. I can turn that tremor into a trigger pull." Sunwoo looked at the brass casing, then at the duffel bag. The ringing in his ears started again, a high-pitched whine that signaled the sensory overload his brain couldn't process. His vision began to blur at the edges, the fluorescent light turning into a jagged halo. He thought of the library. He thought of the quiet life his brother had died to give him. Then, he thought of the way his brother's body had hit the wet concrete. He thought of the way the uncle had smiled as he raised the toast of poisoned wine to their father. The soft boy would have taken the ticket to Zurich. He would have run. But that boy had been left in the river. Sunwoo reached out. His left hand shook, the tremor rattling his bones, but his right hand was steady. He bypassed the passports and gripped the cold, textured handle of the pistol. The weight of it felt right. It felt like the only solid thing in a world of ghosts. "Teach me," Sunwoo said. Muna stared at him for a long beat, her face unreadable. Then, a small, grim smile touched her lips. She reached down and adjusted the bandage on his temple. "The first lesson is free, kid," she said, her voice dropping into a low, tactical hum. "In this world, there is no such thing as a fair fight. There is only the person who stops breathing and the person who walks away. You're going to spend the next few weeks wishing you had died in that crate. But by the time we're done, you won't be a boy anymore. You'll be a haunting." The narrator watched from the shadows of the basement as the flicker of the light bulb died out. The spare had made his choice. The debt was no longer a silent ledger. It was a living thing, breathing in the dark. The climb had not yet begun, but the first step had been taken in a basement that smelled of starch and cold steel. The training did not begin with a weapon. It began with a spoon. For the first 2 weeks, Muna forced Sunwoo to sit at a scarred wooden table, tasked with the simple, agonizing goal of bringing broth to his lips without spilling a drop. The tremor in his left hand was a jagged heartbeat, a physical manifestation of the trauma that had rewritten his nervous system. Every time the liquid splashed against the wood, Muna would strike the table with a heavy ruler. The sound cracked like a gunshot, sending a fresh wave of sensory overload through Sunwoo's fractured mind. "The repository won't kill you because you're weak," Muna would say, her voice as dry as bone. "They'll kill you because you're predictable. Your tremor is a rhythm. Learn the beat, and you can play between the notes." The narrator watched the boy struggle, a ghost of a scholar trying to inhabit the shell of a soldier. In the hazy, fever dream flashbacks that haunted his sleep, Sunwoo saw Jin-ho. His brother wasn't the monster the world knew. He was the man who had sat in the back of libraries, bored and lethal, watching Sunwoo read. Jin-ho had known this day would come. He had whispered things into Sunwoo's ear during late-night walks, logistical vulnerabilities of the Koryo repository, the specific frequencies of the security radios, the private cowardice of the uncle. It had seemed like trivia then. Now, it was a map. By the 3rd week, the spoon was replaced by The Last Gift. Muna's custom 9mm was a masterpiece of cold engineering, balanced to compensate for a shooter who didn't have the luxury of a steady stance. They moved to the kill box, a soundproofed section of the basement filled with hanging sheets of heavy canvas. Muna didn't teach him to stand still and aim. She taught him to move. She rigged the lights to strobe, mimicking the disorienting sensory flashes that Sunwoo's brain injury triggered. "Your injury is an alarm," Muna barked over the roar of a ventilation fan. "When the ringing starts, it means your brain is overclocking. It means you have 5 seconds of hyper-clarity before the darkness takes you. Use those 5 seconds. End the room. Then move." The training was a relentless cycle of failure and pain. Muna would fire live rounds into the floor at his feet to keep him moving. Sunwoo learned to use his brother's silver lighter as a tactile anchor. When the sensory overload became too much, he would flick the casing, the sharp click-clack of the metal acting as a neurological reset. He learned to chamber around with one hand by catching the slide on his belt. He learned the geometry of the kill, the shortest distance between his muzzle and a man's central nervous system. One evening, exhausted and covered in the soot of spent powder, Sunwoo sat on the floor, his head resting against a cold laundry machine. The ringing in his ears was a dull roar. "Why me, Muna?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Jin-ho could have picked anyone. He could have hired 100 men like you to kill the uncle." Muna sat across from him, cleaning a knife with a rag soaked in oil. She didn't look up. 100 men can be bought. 100 men can be anticipated. But a ghost? A ghost is a variable no ledger can account for. Jin-ho didn't want a mercenary. He wanted a legacy. He knew that if the repository saw you coming, they wouldn't even reach for their guns. They'd laugh. And that's when you'll delete them. She stood up and tossed him a fresh magazine. The soft boy is a camouflage, Sunu. Use it. When you walk into that tower, they will see the nephew who liked poetry. They won't see the Reaper's shadow until their blood is on the floor. The transition was subtle, but terrifying. Sunu's movements lost their hesitation. He stopped fighting the tremor and began to time his trigger pulls to the microsecond of stillness between the shakes. His zero-waste kineticism was born from necessity. Because his brain couldn't handle long, sustained combat, he had to become a master of the 3-second execution. He began to see the world as a series of vectors. A door wasn't a door, it was a choke point. A chair wasn't furniture, it was a blunt force tool. He was no longer thinking, he was reacting. The narrator observed the shift with a heavy heart. The boy's eyes, once full of curiosity, were now 2 cold, dark pools that reflected nothing but the mission. In a final test, Muna led him to the center of the room and turned off all the lights. The basement was absolute black, save for the hum of the machines. 6 men, Muna whispered from somewhere in the dark, coming from the north stairwell. You have 3 rounds in the chamber. Go. Sunu didn't reach for his goggles. He closed his eyes. He listened to the air. He felt the vibration of Muna's footsteps, the subtle shift in the room's pressure. The ringing in his ears started, the high-pitched whine of an impending glitch. 5. He tracked the sound of a sleeve brushing against canvas. 4. He smelled the faint scent of gun oil to his left. 3. He flicked the silver lighter in his pocket. Click. In a blur of motion, Sunu fired. 3 suppressed pops echoed in the basement. He didn't stay to check the hits. He rolled, came up in a crouch behind a steel pillar, and transitioned to his knife, his body a coiled spring of calculated violence. The lights flickered back on. 3 wooden targets had been split dead center. Sunwoo was standing behind Muna, the dull training blade pressed against the hollow of her throat. His left hand was shaking violently, the tremor back with a vengeance, but the knife hadn't moved a millimeter from her skin. Muna looked at the reflection of the pale, scarred boy in a nearby mirror. She saw the porcelain ghost he had become. The debt is ready to be collected, she said quietly. Sunwoo pulled the knife away and sheathed it. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked finished. The soft boy had been successfully dismantled, his parts polished and reassembled into something that only knew how to move upward. The obsidian tower, Sunwoo said, his voice devoid of emotion. Tomorrow, Muna replied. Tonight you sleep. Dream of your brother one last time. Because tomorrow, there is only the climb. The narrator watched as Sunwoo lay back on his cot, the silver lighter clutched in his hand. The basement felt smaller now, the walls unable to hold the pressure of the vengeance he carried. The training was over. The muscle had been forged, and the memory had been weaponized. The Koryo repository thought they had buried their problems at the Incheon docks, but they had only planted a seed in the dark. And the harvest was coming. The underground gambling den sat beneath a failing seafood market in Mapo, a place where the air tasted of salt, diesel, and the desperate sweat of men losing money they didn't have. It was run by a man named Kang Dae, the Koryo repository's primary money washer. To the world, Kang Dae was a legitimate logistics tycoon. To the Syndicate, he was the filter through which their blood-soaked won became clean corporate capital. He was also the only man who knew the rotating security ciphers for the Obsidian Tower's private lift. The narrator watched as a black sedan pulled into the rain-slicked alley. Sun-woo stepped out, his silhouette thin and unassuming against the neon glare of a nearby sign. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, a gift from Muna, and carried a leather messenger bag that looked more suited for a university student than an assassin. But beneath the fabric, the last gift was holstered against his ribs, and his brother's silver lighter was tucked into his palm. There was a time, the narrator observed, when this boy would have flinched at the smell of this place. Now he simply categorized the odors. Fear, rot, grease. It was just data to be audited. Sun-woo entered the market. The two guards at the freight elevator barely looked at him. He looked like the kind of soft, rich kid who came to these places to lose his father's money. He didn't speak. He simply handed them a high roller token Muna had acquired years ago. The elevator descended into a cavernous basement filled with the clatter of mahjong tiles and the blue haze of cigarette smoke. Kang Dae was in the back, sitting behind a bulletproof glass partition, counting stacks of currency with a mechanical counter that sounded like a swarm of insects. Sun-woo walked toward the VIP lounge, his left hand beginning to twitch. He felt the sensory overload beginning to creep in. The clashing colors of the neon lights, the overlapping shouts of the gamblers. Click. He flicked the silver lighter in his pocket. The metallic snap centered him. He stepped into Kang Dae's private office before the guards could intervene. "You're in the wrong room, kid," Kang Dae said, not looking up from his machine. "The baccarat tables are outside. This is for grown-ups." "I'm not here for baccarat," Sun-woo said. His voice was soft, almost melodic, but it cut through the room's noise. "I'm here to audit the repository's final quarter." Kang Dae froze. He recognized the cadence of the voice. He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the jagged silver scar on Sun-woo's temple. "Sun-woo? The spare? You're supposed to be at the bottom of the Han River." "My brother left a debt unpaid," Sun-woo said, stepping closer. The two guards in the room moved to intercept him. The narrator held his breath. This was the moment the soft boy would have begged for mercy. But Sun-woo didn't even blink. The ringing in his ears hit a high, piercing frequency. The 5-second window. 5. Sun-woo dropped his messenger bag. 4. As the first guard reached for a baton, Sun-woo stepped into the man's shadow, his movement a blur of calculated efficiency. He didn't draw his gun. He used the edge of the leather bag to deflect the guard's arm, then drove his palm, weighted by the silver lighter, into the man's solar plexus. 3. The second guard drew a pistol. Sun-woo didn't wait for the aim. He gripped the man's wrist, twisted, and used the guard's own momentum to slam his head into the edge of the mahogany desk. 2. He caught the falling guard's pistol midair, ejected the magazine in a single motion, and tossed the useless weapon aside. 1. Silence returned to the office, punctuated only by the hum of the money counter. Kang Dae was backed against the wall, his hand hovering over a panic button. "Don't," Sun-woo said, his left hand trembling violently now that the window had closed. He leaned against the desk for support, the scar on his head throbbing. If you press that, the police will come, and I'll have to kill them too. Then the audit gets messy. What do you want? Kang Dae stammered, his bravado stripped away by the clinical speed of the violence he had just witnessed. The Obsidian Tower. The 61st floor. Sunwoo said, his eyes locking onto Kang Dae's. My uncle has changed the codes every week since the coup. I need tonight's sequence. And I need the whereabouts of the secondary security hub. I can't. He'll kill me. Kang Dae whimpered. Sunwoo reached across the desk and picked up a heavy glass ashtray. He didn't look angry. He looked like a doctor preparing for a difficult surgery. My brother, Jin Ho, told me about you. He said you were the one who suggested the Incheon docks for the extraction. He said you were the one who sold our father's medical records to the uncle. Sunwoo leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The debt isn't just about money, Kang Dae. It's about the truth. Give me the codes, and I leave you with your life. Refuse, and I'll use this ashtray to show you exactly how my brain felt when that bullet hit it. The terror in the room was absolute. Kang Dae looked at the two unconscious guards, then at the pale, fragile boy who had just dismantled them without breaking a sweat. He realized then that the soft air was a lie. This was a ghost that had spent 6 months learning how to haunt. Kang Dae scrambled to a small safe behind his desk, his fingers shaking as he punched in a combination. He pulled out an encrypted tablet and slid it across the desk. It's all in there. The lift codes, the guard rotations, the thermal blind spots, just leave. Sunwoo took the tablet, checking the data with a quick, practiced eye. Jin Ho's voice echoed in his mind. The repository is a clock, Sunwoo. Break the main gear. Thank you for your cooperation, Sunwoo said. He turned to leave, then paused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single high-roller chip, tossing it onto the desk. Bet that on red. It's your lucky color tonight. As Sunwoo walked back through the gambling den, the narrator noted the change in his gait. He wasn't the boy who had walked in. He was heavier now, laden with the weight of the information he had hunted. He had performed his first audit, and the result was clear. The Choreo repository was over-leveraged, and the collection was about to begin. Outside, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, washing the grime of the market into the gutters. Sunwoo got back into the sedan, his left hand finally still. He looked up at the distant glowing needle of the Obsidian Tower piercing the clouds. The first gear is broken, the narrator whispered. But the clock is still ticking. And the higher he climbs, the more blood it will take to keep the hands moving. Sunwoo tapped the tablet. The screen glowed, illuminating the jagged scar on his temple. Muna, he said into his earpiece. I have the codes. Secure the perimeter. I'm going in. The Obsidian Tower rose into the Seoul sky like a jagged shard of volcanic glass, its summit lost in the weeping clouds. It was the architectural heart of the Choreo repository, a monument to the uncle's vanity and the family's ruin. At its base, the lobby was a cathedral of black marble and cold light, patrolled by the secessionists, private contractors in slate-gray suits who moved with the rehearsed arrogance of men who owned the law. The narrator watched from the rain-lashed plaza as the revolving doors hissed open. Sun Wu walked in, his charcoal suit damp, his messenger bag slung across his shoulder. He looked small in the vastness of the hall, a pale insect crawling into the maw of a predator. But as he stepped onto the polished stone, the ringing in his ears began, a high, surgical whine that signaled the start of the final audit. There was a boy who once feared the sound of his own name, the narrator whispered. But as he looked at the men who had aided in his brother's slaughter, that boy was nowhere to be found. There was only the ghost, and the ghost was hungry for the climb. The lead security officer, a man with a scarred jaw and the eyes of a butcher, stepped forward to intercept. "The building is into lockdown, kid. Deliveries go to the rear." Sun Wu didn't stop. He didn't look at the man's face. He looked at the holstered sidearm, the distance to the marble pillar, and the 3 guards flanking the elevator bank. "I'm not a delivery," Sun Wu said, his voice a low, melodic threat. "I'm the inheritance." The guard's hand twitched toward his holster. The narrator felt the air in the lobby turn to ice. Sun Wu's left hand began its rhythmic tremble, but he didn't fight it. He leaned into the sensory overload, allowing the neon lights to sharpen his focus into a single, lethal point. 5. Sun Wu swung the leather messenger bag. It wasn't filled with books. It was weighted with lead plates. The edge of the bag caught the lead guard under the chin, the crack of bone echoing like a gunshot through the marble hall. 4. As the other guards racked their submachine guns, Sun Wu dropped. He didn't dive. He transitioned, sliding across the floor toward the nearest pillar. He drew the last gift from his ribs in a single, fluid motion. Pop, pop. The suppressed rounds were almost silent, but the results were absolute. 2 guards collapsed, the blood blooming like dark flowers on the white marble. 3. Sun Wu reached the pillar. A hail of 9mm rounds chewed the stone into dust above his head. He didn't flinch. He counted the beats of the gunfire, waiting for the pause. 2. He pivoted around the pillar, staying low. He fired 3 times, 1 for the leg to drop the target, 2 for the chest to finish the audit. He moved with a zero-waste efficiency that made the contractors look like amateurs. 1. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of the lobby's fountain and the distant siren of a city that had no idea the war had begun. Sun Wu stood up, his suit jacket dusted with marble powder. His left hand was shaking violently now, his brain struggling to process the rapid-fire feedback of the violence. He reached into his pocket and flicked the silver lighter. Click-clack. The sound anchored him to the present, pushing the hazy memory of the Incheon docks back into the dark. Jin Ho always said the gates were the hardest part, Sun Wu whispered to the empty room. He was wrong. The gates are just the beginning. He walked toward the private elevator bank, stepping over the bodies without a glance. He pulled out the encrypted tablet he had taken from Kang Dae. The screen glowed, reflecting the jagged scar on his temple. He punched in the code, 8802. The elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to reveal a mirrored interior. Sun Wu stepped inside, facing the doors. He caught his own reflection, a pale, fragile-looking boy in a blood-flecked suit. For a second, he saw the student he used to be, the one who read poetry and dreamt of quiet things. Then the elevator began to rise, and the reflection changed. The eyes turned cold. The fragility became a mask. The narrator watched the floor indicator begin its ascent. 1, 5, 10. The boy is gone, the narrator noted, his voice heavy with the weight of the tragedy. The ghost is rising. And 60 floors above, a man in a white suit is about to realize that some debts cannot be settled with money. Some debts require the total liquidation of the soul. The elevator jolted as it passed the 15th floor. A red light began to flash on the control panel. The uncle had realized the gates had been breached. The secessionists were mobilizing. The tower was no longer a corporate office. It was a vertical battlefield. Sunwoo ejected the magazine from the last gift, checked the count, and slapped it back home with the heel of his palm. He didn't look at the flashing red light. He looked at the silver ring on his finger, the cipher that held the secrets of the Koryo repository. "Muna," Sunwoo said into his earpiece, his voice steady even as the elevator groaned under the strain of a remote override. "They've cut the lift. I'm moving to the stairs." "The funnel, Sunwoo," Muna's voice crackled back, sounding like gravel and steel. "Don't let them pin you in the concrete. Be the hunter, not the prey." Sunwoo pried open the elevator doors with a manual lever. He was between floors, looking out into the dark, cavernous interior of the elevator shaft. He grabbed the maintenance ladder and began to climb. The lobby massacre had been the opening statement. Now the audit was moving into the deep ledgers of the building. Each floor was a new chapter of the debt. Each step was a heartbeat his brother would never have. The narrator followed him into the dark, the sound of Sunwoo's boots on the metal rungs echoing like a ticking clock. The obsidian gates were closed behind him. There was no way out but up. And at the top, the darkness was waiting. The stairwell was a vertical tomb of poured concrete and fluorescent hum, a gray throat that swallowed the sound of the city and replaced it with the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots. Sunwoo moved upward, his shadow stretching and snapping against the walls like a fractured thing. He was on floor 19, his lungs burning with the dry, recycled air of the obsidian tower. Every flight of stairs was a reminder of the physical cost of his survival. His legs felt heavy, and the dull ache behind his scar had sharpened into a rhythmic pulse that matched the ticking of a clock. There was a boy who used to skip 2 steps at a time when he ran to meet his brother, the narrator observed, the voice echoing in the hollow silence of the landing. But that boy had muscles that weren't screaming, and a heart that wasn't heavy with the gravity of the dead. Now, every step is a negotiation with a body that wants to stop. Sunwoo paused at the door to floor 20. He pressed his ear to the steel. Beyond it, he heard the metallic snick of safeties being disengaged and the low, muffled static of tactical radios. The secessionists had stopped trying to meet him in the lobby. They were setting up funnels, choke points designed to turn the stairwell into a kill zone. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small glass vial of heavy oil and a handful of ball bearings, tools Muna had taught him to use when the geometry of the kill required a distraction. He didn't open the door. Instead, he moved to the floor above, floor 21, and quietly wedged the door open just a crack. He poured the oil across the landing and scattered the bearings, then retreated back into the stairwell, climbing the underside of the next flight of stairs like a shadow. 5. The door on floor 20 burst open. 4 secessionists in full tactical gear rushed out, their weapon lights cutting through the dimness of the stairwell. 4. They looked down toward the lobby, expecting a frontal assault. Sunwoo, hanging from the railing of the flight above, didn't move. He waited for the ringing in his ears, the signal that his brain was ready to overclock. 3. One of the guards looked up. "He's not below us. Check the—" 2. Sunwoo dropped. He didn't land on his feet. He landed on the lead guard's shoulders, his weight driving the man into the concrete. In the same motion, he fired the last gift twice into the second guard's chest. 1. The remaining 2 guards scrambled to turn their long-barreled rifles in the tight space of the landing. They slipped on the oil and bearings Sunwoo had placed, their footing vanishing. The narrator watched as Sunwoo moved with the terrifying, jerky precision of a broken puppet. He didn't aim with his eyes. He aimed with his memory of the room's dimensions. He used the zero-waste method, 1 shot for the throat, 1 for the visor gap. The suppressed pops were swallowed by the concrete walls. When the landing went silent, Sunwoo sat back against the blood-flecked wall, his left hand spasming so violently it struck the concrete with a hollow thump. He gripped his wrist, his teeth gritted against the surge of white noise in his skull. His vision began to glitch, the gray walls flickering into the hazy golden light of the library where Jinho used to sit. "Breath, Sunwoo," Jinho's voice whispered in his mind, clear as the rain on the docks. "Don't look at the stairs. Look at the space between them. That's where you win." Sunwoo flicked the silver lighter. Click, clack. The metallic reset worked, pulling him back from the brink of a seizure. He stood up, his legs shaking, and looked at the tactical radio on the belt of a fallen guard. He picked it up. "Status on floor 20? A voice crackled, cold, familiar, and dripping with the arrogance of the uncle. Sunwoo didn't answer. He pressed the transmit button and let the radio capture the sound of his ragged, uneven breathing. Then, he dropped the radio onto the chest of the man he had just killed and continued his climb. "The uncle is listening," the narrator noted. "He is listening to the sound of his own empire being audited, 1 floor at a time. He thinks he is safe at the top of the throat, but he forgets that a throat can be choked from the inside." By floor 28, the air began to change. The mechanical hum of the building grew louder, and the smell of ozone filled the stairwell. Sunwoo's glitches were coming faster now. The ringing was no longer a warning, it was a constant companion. He reached the landing of floor 30 and stopped. The heavy steel door was reinforced with a magnetic lock. He checked the tablet. Floor 30 was the secondary security hub, the brain of the Obsidian Tower. If he could breach it, he could shut down the elevators, the cameras, and the automated locks that were turning the tower into a cage. But as he reached for the keypad, a hissing sound filled the stairwell. From the vents above the door, a thick, pale yellow mist began to pour. "Incendiary gas," Sunwoo whispered, his voice cracking. The uncle wasn't trying to shoot him anymore. He was trying to erase him. The gas would fill the concrete throat, and 1 spark, 1 muzzle flash, would turn the stairwell into a chimney of fire. Sunwoo looked up. The mist was descending rapidly, heavy and cloying. The narrator watched as Sunwoo's eyes widened. For the first time since waking up in Muna's basement, the porcelain ghost looked like the soft boy again. He was trapped in the funnel. The stairs below were blocked by the bodies of the men he had killed, and the door in front of him was a wall of steel. "There was a boy who once cried because he was lost in a department store," the narrator said softly. "His brother had found him within minutes, laughing and ruffling his hair. But Jinho is not coming this time. This time, the boy has to find his own way out of the dark." Sunwoo looked at the last gift in his hand. He couldn't fire it. 1 spark, and he would be vaporized. He looked at the silver lighter, the tool of his neurological reset. He couldn't flick it. He took a deep breath, pulling the stinging gas into his lungs, and looked at the magnetic lock. His vision was blurring, the double images of the keypad dancing before his eyes. He had seconds before the gas became too dense to breathe, or before a guard on the other side decided to pull a trigger and end them both. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small, high-powered magnet Muna had given him, an inheritance for a different kind of lock. He placed it against the sensor, his left hand trembling so hard he had to use his chest to pin it against the door. Count the cycles, Sunwoo. 1, 2, 3. The magnetic lock groaned. The red light flickered, turning a pale, sickly green. Sunwoo threw his shoulder against the door just as the first spark of an overhead light fixture ignited a pocket of gas in the ceiling. The explosion behind him blew the door off its hinges, throwing Sunwoo into the security hub as a tongue of flame licked the air where he had been standing a second before. He skidded across the tiled floor, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of red and black. "The throat has spat him out," the narrator whispered as the fire roared in the stairwell behind the sealed door. "He has reached the midpoint. He is halfway to the debt. But the air is getting thinner, and the ghost is running out of time." Sunwoo lay on the floor of the security hub, gasping for clean air, his hand clutching the silver lighter so hard the metal bit into his skin. He looked up at the wall of monitors. On the central screen, he saw the uncle, sitting in a white leather chair on the 60th floor, looking down at a tablet with a bored, expectant expression. Sunwoo pulled himself up. The audit was moving into the middle ledgers, and the interest was piling up. The security hub of floor 30 was a graveyard of blue light and humming servers. Sunwoo lay on the floor, his lungs burning from the acrid ghost of the incendiary gas he had narrowly escaped. Behind the reinforced door, the stairwell had become a vertical furnace, the muffled roar of the fire vibrating through the concrete. He was cut off from the path below. There was no retreating to Muna's basement, no returning to the world of libraries. The only way forward was through the dark. The narrator watched as Sunwoo pulled himself to his knees. The glitch in his brain was no longer a flicker. It was a rhythmic distortion that turned the server racks into swaying monolithic shadows. There was a boy who feared the dark because of what might be hiding in it, the narrator observed. He did not realize that the most dangerous thing in the room was the shadow he cast himself. Sunwoo reached out and smashed the emergency override on the central console. Every light on the floor died instantly. The backup red strobes didn't stand a chance. He had cut the breakers. The floor was plunged into a thick, sensory-deprived ink. This was the audit of the blind. Uncle Taejun's voice crackled through the floor's intercom system, sounding distorted and thin. "Sunwoo, is that you in the dark? You always were a sensitive child. You cried when your father brought home the hunting hounds. You didn't have the stomach for the family trade. Why die for a brother who only saw you as a burden to be hidden?" Sunwoo didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was a desert of ash. He pulled a pair of heavy-duty acoustic dampeners over his ears. He didn't need to hear the uncle's lies. He needed to hear the ghosts. "Floor 30 is a labyrinth, Sunwoo." Jinho's voice echoed in his mind, a memory from a summer night 5 years ago when they had played a game of infiltration in the old estate. "The servers are arranged in a grid of 4. The gaps are exactly 32 inches wide. If you're blind, you don't use your eyes. You use your shoulders. Feel the air move. The machines breathe, Sunwoo. Find the heartbeat. The narrator watched as Sunwoo closed his eyes. He didn't reach for the last gift. He drew his combat knife, the dull training blade now replaced by a razor-sharp edge of carbon steel. He moved into the server forest. The secessionists had entered from the north elevators. 6 men, equipped with night vision goggles that bathed the world in a sickly digital green. They moved in a tactical wedge, their boots clicking on the raised floor tiles. To them, the darkness was an obstacle to be conquered with technology. To Sunwoo, darkness was home. 5. Sunwoo felt the subtle shift in air pressure as the first guard passed a server rack. He didn't strike from the front. He reached through a gap in the machinery, his hand a pale blur, and dragged the man's head back against the metal casing. No gunshot, only the wet, heavy thud of a body meeting the floor. 4. The green-eyed hunters panicked. Their headlamps cut through the dark in frantic arcs, but Sunwoo was already gone, tucked into a cooling vent. 3. He used the zero-waste method Muna had drilled into him. He didn't fight the group, he dissected the individual. He appeared behind the second guard, his knife finding the gap in the tactical vest under the arm, the only place where the body was soft. 2. The ringing in his ears hit a deafening crescendo. His vision glitched, showing him the docks of Incheon again. The rain, the blood, the crate. He felt the cold touch of his brother's hand. Now, Sunwoo, while they're looking for a man, be the ghost. He didn't roll. He flowed. He ducked under a spray of panicked gunfire that shattered a server rack, sending a cascade of white sparks into the air. In that momentary flash, the guards saw him, a pale, blood-stained specter with a jagged scar and eyes that looked right through them. 1. Sunwoo didn't use the knife this time. He used the silver lighter, clutched in his fist like a knuckle duster. He drove it into the third guard's throat, the impact crushing the windpipe. The remaining 3 guards fired blindly into the dark, but Sunwoo was already at the maintenance hatch. The ghost does not stay to argue with the living, the narrator noted as Sunwoo disappeared into the ceiling crawlspace. He only leaves behind the wreckage of their certainty. Sunwoo pulled himself into the narrow, dusty vents above the ceiling tiles. His left hand was clawed, the tremor so intense he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. The copper taste of blood filled his mouth. He crawled toward the heat signature of the main elevator shaft, his chest heaving. Uncle Tae-jun's voice returned, tighter now, the arrogance replaced by a simmering venom. You think you're honoring him? Jin-ho died because he was weak, Sunwoo. He loved you more than the repository. That was his flaw. He traded a kingdom for a librarian. I am simply correcting his mistake. Sunwoo stopped crawling. He pressed his forehead against the cold metal of the vent. The glitch was fading, leaving him in a state of hollow, crystalline clarity. My brother didn't trade a kingdom, Sunwoo whispered, his voice finally returning, raspy and cold. He burned it, and I'm just here to sweep up the ash. He reached the end of the vent. Below him was the express lift to the 45th floor, the executive tier. He saw the cables humming, the counterweights moving with a rhythmic groan. The narrator watched as Sunwoo checked the magazine in the last gift. He was halfway through the building, but his body was already at the breaking point. The trauma to his head was a ticking clock, and the alarm was getting louder. There was a boy who loved the quiet of the night, the narrator said, his voice fading as Sun Wu prepared to drop onto the roof of the rising elevator. But the night is over. The ghosts have done their work. Now there is only the man, the height, and the settling of the debt. Sun Wu kicked out the vent grating. He didn't hesitate. He stepped into the void, falling toward the mechanical heart of the tower. He was no longer climbing a building. He was falling upward, toward the final audit. The express lift ascended with a predatory hum, a glass and steel cage soaring through the hollow marrow of the obsidian tower. Sun Wu lay flat on the roof of the car, his fingers hooked into the maintenance housing. The air rushing past him smelled of ozone and cold grease. Below, the fires of the 30th floor were a dying ember. Above, the executive tier beckoned with a sterile, white light. The narrator watched the boy's silhouette against the blur of the passing floors. There was a boy who once believed that gifts were wrapped in paper and tied with silk, the narrator observed. He did not know that the most precious gifts are forged in the fires of loss and handed over in the dark. Muna gave him the gun, but Jin Ho gave him the reason. Now, he must find the strength to keep both. The elevator jolted to a halt at floor 45. Sun Wu rolled off the roof and dropped through the emergency hatch, landing silently on the plush, cream-colored carpet of the executive lobby. This floor was different. There were no concrete walls or industrial servers here. This was a forest of glass partitions, expensive art, and the suffocating silence of absolute power. Standing at the end of the long corridor was not a squad of contractors, but a single figure. He was a man named Han, a ghost from the Koryo Repository's old guard. He didn't wear tactical gear. He wore a tailored suit and held a slender, curved blade that caught the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Han had been Chinho's sparring partner. He was the man who had taught the brothers that a blade never jams and a shadow never misses. "Sun Wu," Han said, his voice a low, melodic baritone. "I told your brother you were too fragile for this world. He disagreed. He said you were the only thing in this family that wasn't rotten." Sun Wu raised the last gift, his left hand trembling with a violence that made the suppressed barrel dance. The ringing in his ears was a physical wall of sound now, a scream of neurological static that threatened to plunge him into a seizure. "Step aside, Han," Sun Wu rasped. "I cannot," Han replied, stepping into a low crouch. "The uncle pays the debt. But your brother was my friend. I will make this quick. A mercy for the boy who shouldn't be here." Han moved. He was faster than the secessionists, faster than the strobing lights of the security hub. He was a blur of steel and motion. 5. Sun Wu fired. Pop, pop. Han didn't dodge. He anticipated. He twisted his body mid-stride, the bullets shattering a glass vase behind him. 4. Han closed the distance. The blade flashed in a crescent arc. Sun Wu felt the bite of the steel as it sliced through his charcoal jacket and the skin of his forearm. He stumbled back, the last gift slipping from his blood-slicked fingers. 3. The gun hit the carpet with a dull thud, sliding away toward the edge of the floor. Sun Wu was disarmed, his primary weapon gone, his vision doubling as the glitch took hold of his brain. 2. Han stepped in for the killing blow, the blade aimed at the hollow of Sun Wu's throat. "Goodbye, little scholar," he whispered. In that microsecond of impending death, the narrator saw the shift. Sun-woo didn't reach for the gun. He didn't scream. He reached into his pocket and closed his hand around the silver lighter. "The last gift isn't the gun, Sun-woo." Muna's voice echoed, sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "The last gift is the realization that you have nothing left to lose." 1. Sun-woo didn't retreat. He stepped into the strike. He used his wounded arm to parry the hilt of Han's blade, the steel sliding harmlessly over his shoulder. With his right hand, he drove the silver lighter, clutched tight as a knuckle duster, into the side of Han's knee. The sound of the joint shattering was the only noise in the room. Han gasped, his balance vanishing. As the assassin fell, Sun-woo didn't stop. He moved with a cold, mechanical brutality that had no room for poetry. He grabbed Han's hair, pulled his head back, and struck the temple with the heavy, silver-weighted fist. Again and again. The narrator watched as the soft boy disappeared entirely. There was no hesitation in the strikes, no flicker of the scholar's mercy. Every blow was a syllable in a sentence that had been written 6 months ago on the Incheon docks. Han slumped to the floor, unconscious or dead, his tailored suit ruined. Sun-woo stood over him, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. His left hand was clawed, the tremor so intense it looked like a frantic heartbeat. He looked at the silver lighter in his hand. The metal was dented, stained with a dark smear of red. "There was a boy who once cried over a broken bird in the garden," the narrator said softly. "He spent 3 days trying to fix its wing with tape and hope. That boy is buried under 45 floors of concrete and blood. The man who stands here now knows that some things cannot be fixed. They can only be ended." Sun-woo didn't go back for the gun. He looked at the last gift lying in the shadows and left it there. It was a tool for a student. He was no longer a student. He picked up Han's fallen blade, the weighted steel feeling strange but certain in his hand. He walked toward the floor's private balcony, looking out at the city below. The rain was still falling, a billion silver needles stitching the earth to the sky. He could see the lights of the harbor where his brother had fallen. The debt was almost settled. He turned back to the elevator, the blade held loosely at his side. The 60th floor was waiting. The uncle was waiting. And the glitch in his brain was telling him he had very little time left before the clock ran out. "He has moved beyond the weapons of the living," the narrator noted as Sun-woo entered the final lift. "He is carrying only the steel and the silence. The 61st floor is not a destination. It is a reckoning. And the ghost is finally home." Sun-woo pressed the button for the penthouse. As the doors closed, he looked at his reflection in the polished steel. The jagged scar on his temple seemed to glow in the dim light. He flicked the silver lighter one last time. Click-clack. The sound was no longer a reset. It was a countdown. The private elevator ascended in a silence so absolute it felt heavy. There was no hum of machinery here, only the thrum of blood in Sunwoo's ears and the erratic, stuttering rhythm of his own heart. The display crawled past 55, 58, 60. The doors slid open with a soft, expensive hiss, revealing the threshold of the king. The narrator watched as Seung-woo stepped out. There was a boy who once thought a king was a man who wore a crown of gold, the narrator observed. He did not know that in this tower, a king is merely the man who owns the most silence. And tonight, the silence is about to be broken. The penthouse was a vast, open expanse of white marble and glass, suspended above the clouds like a secular heaven. It was stripped of the corporate clutter of the floors below. There were no desks here, no server racks, no tactical squads. There was only the wind howling against the reinforced windows and the soft orange glow of a fireplace that looked out of place in such a clinical fortress. Seung-woo walked forward, his boots leaving faint red outlines on the pristine white floor. He held Han's blade low at his side. His left hand was no longer just trembling. It was a ghost limb, spasming in a way that pulled his entire shoulder out of alignment. The glitch was no longer a warning. It was the atmosphere. The world around him was fracturing into frames, the white marble floor appearing to ripple like the surface of the Han River. He reached the center of the room, where a single white leather chair faced the panoramic view of the city. "You look terrible, Seung-woo," a voice said. It was smooth, devoid of the static of the intercom, carrying the familiar scent of expensive tobacco and old, inherited malice. Uncle Tae-jun did not turn around. He sat with a glass of amber liquid in one hand, his white suit glowing in the firelight. He looked like a man who had already won, a man who had successfully audited a family out of existence. "The head injury," Tae-jun continued, his tone conversational. "I told the doctor to be thorough, but it seems he left just enough of you intact to be a nuisance. Or perhaps it was the cold water. They say the river has a way of preserving the things it should have drowned." Seung-woo stopped 10 feet behind the chair. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Every ounce of his willpower was funneled into staying upright, into keeping the blade from falling from his numb fingers. The ringing in his ears had become a choir of white noise, screaming at him that the debt was due and his time was up. "Do you know why Jin-ho died?" Tae-jun asked, finally standing and turning to face his nephew. He looked fresh, rested, and utterly untroubled by the 60 floors of carnage below him. "It wasn't because of the coup. It was because he thought he could be a monster and a brother at the same time. He thought he could protect you from the mud while he stood knee-deep in it. That was his good bond. That was his death sentence." Tae-jun stepped closer, his eyes scanning Seung-woo with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Look at you. You've killed my men. You've burned my stairwells. You've even bested Han. And for what? You're a broken machine, Seung-woo. Even if you kill me, you'll be dead within the hour. Your brain is a house on fire." The narrator watched the two men, the king in his white suit and the ghost in his charcoal rags. "There was a boy who used to believe his uncle was a giant," the narrator said. But as Seung-woo looked through the double vision of his failing eyes, he saw only a small man standing in a very large room. A man who had traded everything for a view of a city that didn't know he existed. Seung-woo raised the blade. His arm shook, the tip of the steel tracing erratic circles in the air. "I didn't come here to live," Seung-woo rasped, the words catching on the dry heat of his throat. "Then why?" Tae-jun laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "For revenge? For a brother who can't feel it? For a father who died before he could even see you fail?" Seung-woo flicked the silver lighter. Click-clack. The sound was faint, nearly lost to the wind, but it was the only truth left in the room. In that moment, the glitch reached its peak. The white room vanished, replaced by the docks of Incheon. He saw Jin Ho again, not as a memory, but as a presence. He felt his brother's hand on his shoulder, steadying the tremor, guiding the blade. "The debt isn't about the money, Soon-woo," the memory whispered. "It's about who gets to tell the story when the lights go out." "I came here," Soon-woo said, his voice suddenly clear, the tremor in his hand vanishing for one final, impossible second of neurological clarity. "To close the ledger." Taejun's smile faded. He reached into his waistband, pulling a small, nickel-plated revolver, the coward's last line of defense. The narrator held his breath. This was the threshold, the moment where the soft boy and the porcelain ghost met at the end of the world. There were no more floors to climb, no more tactics to deploy. There was only the king, the ghost, and the cold, hard math of a family's end. There was a boy who was never meant to see the color of his own heritage, the narrator whispered as Soon-woo took a step forward, the blade catching the firelight. But the heritage has found him, and it is red, it is heavy, and it is finally, mercifully, here. The wind shrieked against the glass as the two men stood locked in the silence of the threshold. The city below continued to pulse with indifferent light, unaware that at the top of the obsidian tower, the final audit had begun. The fire in the hearth crackled, a sudden, sharp punctuation to the silence of the 60th floor. Taejun leveled the nickel-plated revolver, his face tightening into a mask of clinical necessity. He didn't see a nephew. He saw a bad investment that needed to be written off. "There was a boy who once begged for his brother to stay," the narrator whispered, the voice drifting through the white marble hall like a final breath. "Now, he is the reason no one stays at all. The debt has reached its maturity, and the ledger demands a signature in salt and iron." Taejun fired. The crack of the small caliber echoed, a pathetic sound compared to the roar of the lower floors. The round grazed Soon-woo's shoulder, tearing the charcoal fabric and spinning him back. But Soon-woo didn't fall. The glitch in his brain surged, a tidal wave of white-hot neural static that stripped away the pain and replaced it with a terrifying, crystalline stillness. In his mind, the Incheon docks and the obsidian tower became one. The rain outside the glass was the same rain that had washed Jin Ho's blood into the sea. Soon-woo moved. He didn't run. He lunged, a jagged movement that defied the logic of his shattered motor skills. Taejun fired again, the bullet whizzing past Soon-woo's ear. But the porcelain ghost was already inside his guard. The narrator watched as Soon-woo drove Hong's blade upward. It wasn't a poet's strike or a scholar's gesture. It was the mechanical culmination of every hour spent in Muna's basement, every drop of broth spilled from a trembling spoon. The steel found the gap in the white silk of Taejun's vest, sinking deep into the chest of the man who had traded a family for a view. Taejun's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a silent O of realization. The revolver slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the marble. Soon-woo didn't let go of the hilt. He leaned into the man, his forehead pressing against his uncle's, the jagged scar on his temple pulsing with a rhythmic, dying heat. Jin Ho sent his regards. Soon-woo rasped. the words torn from a throat that had forgotten how to speak of anything but vengeance. He twisted the blade. A single, sharp motion. The ledger was closed. Taejun slumped, the weight of the man pulling Sun-woo down with him. They collapsed together onto the white floor, the blood spreading in a slow, crimson tide that ruined the purity of the room. Sun-woo lay there, his chest heaving, his left hand finally, mercifully, still. The ringing in his ears began to fade, replaced by a soft, distant hum that sounded like the turning pages of a book in a quiet library. "The debt is settled," the narrator noted, the voice sounding weary, as if it had walked every one of the 60 floors alongside the boy. "The king is dead in his white suit, and the ghost is finally resting. But a tower built on bones cannot stand forever, and the boy who survived the river has no more rivers to cross." Sun-woo pulled himself away from the body, crawling toward the floor-to-ceiling window. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver lighter. It was dented, blackened by soot, and slick with the audit's final payment. He looked at the cipher ring on his finger. The secrets of the Choreo repository. The wealth, the power, the blood. He didn't want it. He flicked the lighter. Click, clack. A small, defiant flame danced in the draft of the penthouse. He held the encrypted tablet, the heart of the empire, over the fire. The plastic bubbled, the data inside screaming as the circuits melted into slag. He dropped it into the hearth, watching the legacy of the repository turn into nothing more than blue smoke and ash. "There was a boy who loved his brother," the narrator said, the words softening as the lights of soul began to blur in Sun-woo's vision. And in the end, that was the only thing the Syndicate couldn't audit. Not the money, not the betrayal, only the love that turned a librarian into a reaper. Sun-woo leaned his head against the cold glass of the window. His vision was failing for the last time, the darkness rising to meet him like the tide at Incheon. But he wasn't afraid. Through the haze, he saw a silhouette standing by the elevators. Not Muna, not a guard. It was Jin-ho. He was wearing his old leather jacket, his hands in his pockets, a small, proud smile on his face. He wasn't bleeding. He didn't look tired. He looked like he was waiting for a younger brother to finish his homework. Sun-woo closed his eyes. The tremor in his hand vanished. The ringing stopped. For the first time in 6 months, there was no glitch, no sensory overload, no concrete throat. "Wait for me," Sun-woo whispered to the silence. The narrator stood in the center of the ruined penthouse, looking down at the pale boy who had climbed a mountain of glass just to find a place to sleep. "The story of the Choreo repository ends here," the narrator concluded. "Not with a coronation, but with a closing. The spare did not become the king. He became the end of the line. And as the sun rises over a city that will never know his name, the boy is finally, truly, home." The fire in the hearth died down to a low red glow. The silver lighter lay on the marble, cold and quiet. The obsidian tower stood silent against the dawn, a monument to a debt that had been paid in full. The narrator turned away, the voice fading into the wind. there was a boy, and he lived.